Alright, I'm going to read for like a few minutes and then go out. I think I was on page 400. Um, 20 something. I was going to leave after I paid a visit to old aunt and new aunt on Chongming Island. That was only proper. But before I could go to the island, Danru got sick with a high fever, then turned yellow with jaundice. I read this part. The old aunt of yours nearly tore the letter in half. I was so anxious when I saw the man standing at my door. How can you say it is only a little illness, nothing important? Health is always the most important thing. Okay, I've read this part too. I have already told you how my aunties treated me when I was a child. So I had always thought they did not care about me very much, that they saw me as a nuisance, a burden. And I always thought I had no strong feelings for them in return. Why should I? So you can imagine how surprised I was to find my eyes stinging with tears as our flatboat drew close to the island. I tried to tell myself it was only the sharp, cold winter hurting my eyes, but then I saw them, uncle, old aunt, new aunt, waving to me from the harbor, screaming and shouting, "There she is!" And I knew it was not the wind. They all looked old and worn, old aunt especially. She had lost the sharpness of her features. Even her eyes, which had once been a very dark black-brown, had faded in color. New aunt had sprouted many white hairs, and fine wrinkles lined each smiling cheek, just like a spider's web. And uncle was a man walking in his dreams, waking up only when someone shouted at him, "Be careful, come this way." In fact, it was seeing uncle this way that made me realize he and my father were alike. They shared the same lost mind, the same weak spirit. Their eyes moved slowly back and forth as they took in everyone else's opinions, unable to make up their own minds. And this made me think how both had always been this way. All those years, they only pretended to lead, shouted when they did not know how to speak, frightened people when they were afraid themselves. Old aunt stroked my cheek many times, telling me, look at you, pale and thin. And this little boy, it can't be. Your son, so big already? Danru stepped forward and gave old aunt the present I had bought, a few ounces of precious ginseng root. For you, Danru said. He frowned, then remembered what he was supposed to say. So you will live forever. He frowned again. Always in good health. He added. He frowned again, turned to me. Is that all? I nodded. Old aunt and new aunt patted his head and laughed. In your last letter, it seems you were saying he was only 6 years old this new year. Can this be? He's so smart. Look at his eyes, the same as little Gong's. I did not know if the years in between had softened her into someone more kind, or if I was only seeing this for the first time because I had been through so much hardness in my life. Where are little Gong and little Gao? I asked. They must be how old? 15, 16? 19 and 20, said new aunt. That old already? And what are they doing? Are they in a good university? Old aunt and new aunt looked at each other as if to decide what to say. They work at the dockyard now, just down the road, said new aunt at last. Fixing ships, added old aunt, although soon they will be returning to their studies, going to college. Actually, they do not fix the ships themselves, said new aunt. They bring the metal to the other workers. One loads, the other pushes the wheelbarrow. Terrible work. I tried to imagine those two spoiled boys now grown up and working so bitterly hard. Ah, wait. You see how it is. New aunt tried to explain. Your uncle's business did very poorly during the war. Many of the machines rusted. There was no money to fix them and keep the factory going strong. So you see what has happened to the house and our family, she said. When the tree dies, the grass underneath withers. Ah, I said, this is very sad to hear. Even sadder than you can imagine, old aunt said, and they walked with me and Danru around the house to Old East and New West to show me what they meant. The big house had gone shabby. Paint was peeling everywhere. Tiles on the floor were cracked so that dirt underneath showed, and the beds all sagged deeply in the middle. Not even enough money to tighten the rope lattice frames. But what saddened me most was the greenhouse. All the little windows were cracked or broken, and the paint on the wooden frame was raised up in splintery leaves. And after many seasons of rain and heat, everything inside had turned black with decay or mold. So many changes. Seeing all this, hearing what had happened to them, how could I accuse old aunt and new aunt of giving me a bad marriage? How could I ask them to help me out of my miserable life? No, I could not ask them. We were still standing outside the greenhouse when I asked about Peanut. And what about your daughter? I said to new aunt. Is she still living at the house on Hede Road? The last letter I had from her was maybe 2 years ago. Every letter, she apologized for not writing sooner, then said nothing after that. Peanut, what a silly girl. Hearing Peanut's name, Uncle seemed to wake up. He huffed in a disgusted tone, then stood up and walked away, back toward the house. Peanut is already dead, he shouted back to us. Danru and I both jumped a little. What? Is this true? I cried. Peanut, dead? Uncle is still very angry with her, explained new aunt. Danru, old aunt said, are you hungry? Danru shook his head. Go follow grand uncle back to the house, said old aunt. Go ask old cook to give you a bowl of noodles. Danru looked at me. Listen to grand auntie, I said. After Danru left, new aunt said, Peanut ran away from her marriage. She went to a bad group of people who claimed they helped women escape feudal marriages. She didn't have a feudal marriage, said old aunt. She agreed she wanted to marry, and those people who helped her, they didn't tell her the truth. At least not in the beginning. I should have slapped her more often when she was a child. They deceived her, said new aunt. They didn't tell her the truth until it was too late. They're a communist. That's what we think. Yes, can you imagine? Of course, her husband divorced her. Why would he want her back? Said old aunt. And then he put an announcement in all the big and little newspapers in Shanghai. He said, I'm divorcing from Jiang Hua-zhen, deserter wife. Your poor uncle, he read this while eating his midday meal, almost choked to death on a piece of radish. So now uncle thinks she did this on purpose to kill all of us as well, said new aunt. This is not true. She has a good heart. It's only her mind that is rotten. But still, now we are all in danger. You see how things are. All this talk about unity among all the parties? Nonsense. If the Kuomintang find out we have a daughter who is a communist, all of our heads could be rolling down the street. What a stupid girl, said old aunt. What happened to all the things I taught her? No firm ideas in her head. I should have beat her harder. She lost her marriage? I said. I'm sorry to hear this. That's what I said, but guess what I was thinking? Of course, I was wondering how Peanut had done this, left her marriage. I was wondering when I could ask her how I could do the same. To be polite, Danru and I stayed 2 weeks at my uncle's house. Less time and they would have thought I did not consider them important enough. Before coming to the island, I had gone to the bank and withdrawn the last of my dowry money. As I already told you, Chinese money was not worth too much after the war. By my memory, I had maybe 2,000 left. By then, it was all worth only a couple $100 American, and I used some of that money to treat my relatives well. Every day I walked to the market with new aunt and old aunt. Every day I would pick out the vegetables and meat, expensive things I knew they had not tasted in a long time. Every day, new aunt and I got into loud arguments in front of the shopkeepers over who would pay. Every day, I would pay. During one of those walks to the market, I finally told my aunties I wanted to see Peanut. Impossible, new aunt said right away. Too dangerous. I would not allow you, said old aunt. That girl does not deserve to see anyone. On the morning when Danru and I were supposed to leave, new aunt came into our room early. She ordered Danru to go say goodbye to his grand-uncle. When we were alone, she started to give me a long lecture on Peanut, as if I still wanted to see her, as if all her faults were mine. Maybe no one knows she is a communist, new aunt explained, but she's still a bad influence, like a diseased person. She should not be allowed to contaminate anyone else. That's why you cannot see her. I listened, not saying anything. At the end of her speech, new aunt sighed and said, I can see there's no use arguing with you. Well then, if I cannot stop you, at least you cannot hold me responsible. She threw a piece of paper down on the bed and left. It was an address, as well as instructions on what bus to take, what alleys to look for. Suddenly, new aunt appeared again at the door. You should not let old aunt know I gave you this, she whispered, then left again. And in that way, I knew that she had secretly visited Peanut herself. A few minutes later, it was old aunt who walked into my room. And now I must ask you for a favor, she said. She set a small wrapped package on the bed. This is something I borrowed from a friend long time ago. I feel so ashamed I never returned it. When you find time, maybe you can take it to her. On the top of the package was the same address new aunt had given me and the name Miss Lee. I feel so ashamed, said old aunt, tears now coming into her eyes. Don't tell anyone. After I returned to Shanghai, I waited a week before I went to see Peanut. I did not tell anyone about this, however. I walked out the door in everyday clothes as if I might be going to the market to shop for food or maybe to take a little walk in the park. When I was 2 blocks away, I jumped onto a bus. I have already told you a little bit about Peanut. She was a girl who loved every kind of comfort. She cared only about pretty clothes and powder on her face. She always followed what was fashionable but had no ideas of her own. So you can imagine what I was thinking, so that the bus took me farther and farther into a bad part of the city. I got off at Sanyan Road, and from there I had to walk down streets too narrow for cars but filled with bicycles and pedicabs and carts. She lived in the Japanese section, where buildings curved around corners just like the long body of a dragon. The buildings all looked alike, 2-story brick buildings with steep tiled roofs. Along those alleys there were no sidewalks, just rough roads covered with coal dust and spit. You might think this should have been the best part of town, since the Japanese had occupied Shanghai for so many years. Certainly there were some good parts, but most of that section had been built long before the war, and I thought it had an awful smell and was dirty and crowded. If you ask my opinion, maybe it was only a little bit better than the Chinese section. I don't know why so many students, writers, and artists like to live here. Maybe they thought it was romantic. If you had no food, you could eat each other's ideas. And there were many, many prostitutes, although not the high-class kind who lived in nightclub houses on Nanjing Road. These girls were called roadside wives, and every few steps, it seemed, I passed one standing in front of a three-stool restaurant or a wine shop only as wide as the door, or a steep stairway leading to a second-story tea house. And then I came to a street filled with bargain stores, so many of them, all selling used books, used maps, used magazines, history, romance, poetry, politics, forbidden stories. A man called out to me. From underneath his table, he brought out a magazine. It had an illustration of a crying young woman being held by the ghost shadow of a man. I stopped to look. They were just like those stories Peanut and I used to read in the greenhouse. And standing in the street, I remembered those stories about girls who disregarded their parents' advice and then married for love, that sort of thing. And then the endings were always sad, with scary morals given at the end. Lose control, lose your life. fall in love, fall into disgrace. Throw away family values, throw your face away. I remembered the ones that made me cry the most. I used to think they were like my mother's own life, as sad as a story. At that moment, and not until then, did I consider that all these stories were false, only stories. Like Peanut and everyone else, I had imagined an unhappy ending to my mother's life. Like Peanut, I had allowed myself to be scared by those sad tales. And look what happened. It did not prevent disaster from coming into my life, just the opposite. And then I thought about it this way. Perhaps my mother's life was now filled with joy. Perhaps I too could still find the same thing. This was my hope. I can honestly tell you that is exactly what I was thinking. This is why I have always thought that what followed next was not just coincidence. It was a sign that I had finally come to a true thought of my own. Because this is what happened. I felt someone tapping my shoulder. I turned around. I did not recognize him at first. This smiling man, Winnie, he said, "Do you remember?" I thought to myself, that name, Winnie, it sounds familiar. You see, I thought he was saying that was his name. I was struggling to remember. And then he said, "I've never forgotten the trouble I caused you." What? What was this man talking about? And then I recognized his voice. The Chinese-American soldier, Jimmy Louis, the one who had named me Winnie. Yes, your father, just like that. 5 years later, our past and future bumping into one another on a strange street in Shanghai. Can you imagine? If I had not gone to see Peanut, if I had not stopped to read a silly magazine, if he had not been looking for a newspaper, 1 minute later, and our lifetimes would have missed each other. I ask you, isn't that fate meant to be? That's what I said to your father many years later. After we were married, how lucky we were that fate brought us together. But your father did not think it was fate, at least not the Chinese idea of 命运. Fate, he told me, is somebody else deciding your life for you. Our love was greater than that. And here he used the American word destiny, something that could not be prevented. Well, that sounded the same as fate to me. He insisted it was different, an important difference. So I told him, maybe you see things in an American way, and I see the same things in a Chinese way. You are saying, look at the pretty fish in a bowl, and I say, look at the pretty bowl with the fish. And it does not matter what words we use. It is the same pretty bowl, the same pretty fish. But your father still insisted. We loved each other from the moment we met. That's why our two wills joined together to find each other. After that, I didn't say anything. How could I tell your father that I did not love him from the moment we met? Not in Kunming, not at that dance. I did not know such an instant feeling existed. So how could I feel it? Of course, after I bumped into him that second time, my love for him happened very, very quickly. So maybe we were both right, and it was my fate and his destiny. But later your father became a minister, and he decided it was God's will that brought us together. So now I can no longer explain how we found each other. All I can say is this. I was on a small road in Shanghai. Your father was at that same place. After we bumped into one another, we stood there making polite conversation for a few minutes. And then Jimmy Louis, I still called him Jimmy Louis in those early days, both names, like the Chinese way. Jimmy Louis asked me to have some tea at a place just across the road, to sit down and rest a while. I agreed, but only to be polite. Really, I had no intention of starting something. We found ourselves sitting in a small upstairs tea house, a place I thought was very dirty. I saw the waitress take away cups from one table and rinse them in cold dirty water before she filled them with tea and gave them to us. I had to wash those cups twice with hot tea before I would drink any. I did the same with Jimmy Louis' cup. You see, even back then, I was already worrying about his stomach. We drank our tea quietly for a few minutes, and then he asked me about Wenfu. Does he still use the name Judas? I laughed, then pretended to scold him. That was bad, what you did. My husband was very angry with me. But I was the one who gave him that name, not you. I was too embarrassed to remind him of our dance together, how friends had teased Wenfu that had already been conquered by an American, and I could not tell him about the fight Wenfu and I had afterward. Although my face burned with anger just thinking about it, Jimmy Louis must have seen the look on my face, because right away he said, "It was terrible what I did. I'm sorry." No, I said. I'm thinking about other matters, how so many years have gone by, how everything has changed, but nothing has become better. Jimmy Louis knew we should not talk about this further, so instead we talked about other people. I told him about Jiaguo and his new job in Harbin, how Hulan did not yet have a child. He told me that most of his friends in the American Air Force had been sent north to Peking to help with the Japanese surrender. He was still with the U.S. Information Service, press relations for the American Consulate General. A very big job, I said. Only a big name, he said. I read different newspapers every day. I keep an eye on what is reported. And then he said, "You see, I'm a spy." Of course, he was only joking. He always liked to tease people. You remember this about your father. I don't know why Helen still thinks he really was a spy. He wasn't. Don't listen to her. If he really was, why should he joke so openly? In any case, we had more tea, more and more. Soon I found myself telling him about my uncle's factory, how poor they now were, how hard my boy cousins now had to work. And Jimmy Louis did not look down on them or pity my family. He had sympathy. He said the war was like a bad illness, and when it was over, it did not mean everyone suddenly became healthy again. I told Jimmy Louis about Peanut. I did not say she was a communist. I only said she was divorced. And Jimmy Louis did not say, "What a bad woman that Peanut is." He said, "Many marriages could not survive a war." So finally I told him about my father, what trouble he was in for cooperating with the Japanese. He said this was a terrible tragedy, that wartime had led people to mistakes they otherwise would not have walked into. You see how he was. I felt I could tell him almost anything and find some sort of comfort. For an American, he had a lot of sympathy, and yet I still did not tell him about my marriage. Not yet. "How about you?" I asked. "Back home, how is your family? Do your wife and children miss you?" "No wife, no children," he said. "No such luck." And then he brought out a little photograph. It showed 4 young women sitting in a row, youngest to oldest, wearing modern dresses and hairstyles. They were the daughters of Miss Liang, a schoolmate of his aunt's. And this Miss Liang, he told me, said he could pick any one of her daughters for his wife. Each daughter is educated, said Jimmy Louis. Each one plays the piano. Each one can read the Bible in English. Very attractive and stylish too, I said. So many choices, so hard to decide. Which one are you thinking of marrying? He laughed and then became serious. You, he said. But you are already married. This is true. He said exactly that. He could have chosen any one of those 4 beautiful girls, all of them innocent and young, none of them married before. But he picked me. Why do you think he did that? In any case, at that time, I did not know if he was teasing or truly being sincere. My face was red, and because I could not look at him, I looked at my watch instead. "Oh yo," I said. "If I go see Pina now, I will have to leave as soon as I arrive." "Better come back tomorrow to see her," suggested Jimmy Louis. "There's no other way," I agreed. "Tomorrow, then, I will meet you at the bookshop across the street and walk with you to make sure you're safe," he said. No, too much trouble," I said. "No trouble. I come here every day for the newspapers." "Every day? This is my job." "I was thinking I might come at 10:30. Perhaps that is too early for you." "I will be here even earlier, in case you're early too." And as we both stood up and walked down the stairs, I saw what he did. He left a photograph of 4 beautiful girls on the table. Alright, I'll stop here. Let me just finish this chapter. There are only 1.5 pages left. The next morning I woke up very early, happy and excited. I was thinking about my life, that it was about to change. I did not know exactly how this would happen, but I was certain that it would. But all these thoughts soon disappeared. Danru's screams ran through the house, and a servant brought him to me, reporting how he had fallen and bumped his head down a whole flight of stairs. While I was comforting my son, Sanma came crying to me, telling me that my father had woken up with a fever and a confused mind. So I rushed to my father's room. A few minutes later, the cook came running in, declaring she was leaving for good. She would not tolerate any more of Wen Taitai's insults to her cooking, and from where I stood, I could hear Wen Fu shouting at the top of his voice, and then the sound of something breaking on the floor. I went downstairs and saw the breakfast dishes scattered everywhere, noodles spilled all over the chairs. I wanted to cry. My life would never change, it seemed to me. I was forever worrying over other people's problems with no time to take care of my own. And I was sure all these small disasters were a sign that I would not be able to leave the house that day. But life is so strange, the way it can fool you into thinking one way, then another. Because as soon as I gave up my plans for the day, my chance came back again. When I went upstairs to nurse my father, he was reading a newspaper and was irritated only that I had disturbed him. He must have been fighting with himself in a bad dream, said Sanma. When I went back downstairs, Wen Fu had already left for the horse rest track. And the cook who was mad, she had already cleaned up the mess and had gone to the market to buy food for our evening meal. Little Danru shouted to me from his bed that he wanted to get up. He had forgotten his bump and was now remembering that Wen Fu's mother had promised that today he could go visit a family friend who had a little grandson just his age. Finally, I could leave the house, but I saw it was too late to change my life. Almost 11 o'clock already. I tried to keep all my thoughts on seeing Peanut. What a happy reunion this would be. I was carrying the little package old aunt has asked me to bring. To that I had added 5 pairs of imported stockings. How happy Peanut would be to see this. But of course, my mind kept turning to that little bookshop across from the tea house. I pictured Jimmy Louie browsing through books, impatiently looking at his watch. I thought about hiring a taxi, and then I imagined Jimmy Louie looking at his watch once again, then leaving the store. I decided not to hurry myself to what would surely be an empty disappointment, so I pushed my hopes down and waited for the bus. When I arrived at Sanyin Road, it was already almost noon. I had to force myself to walk slowly, calmly, and as I drew close to that bookshop, I had to force myself not to look. Keep walking, keep walking. I could not breathe. I told myself, don't fool yourself. He isn't there. Keep walking. I did not allow myself to look to the side. My eyes faced the center of the road. Don't look. Keep walking. I passed the bookshop. I didn't look. I kept walking until I was 1 block away. I stopped. I let out a big sigh, and I had a little ache in my heart and realized I had let some hope leak out of there. And then I sighed again, this one very sad, and another sigh followed, one of relief. Only it did not come from me. I turned around to see his face, the joy on his face. We said no words. He took my hands and held them firmly, and we both stood in the road, our eyes wet with happiness, knowing without speaking that we both felt the same way. And now I have to stop, because every time I remember this, I have to cry a little by myself. I don't know why something that made me so happy then feels so sad now. Maybe that is the way it is with the best memories. Alright. Amazing. Finally, Wei Wei is about to change her life, moving to America, starting life all over again. Alright, thanks for reading with me. Bye.